8th January 1943, Stalingrad pocket. The German soldier had lost the memory of his own name. Gebreiter Helmfischer. That is what was stamped on his dog tag, but the metal disc had frozen to his chest weeks ago, and he had long since stopped checking it. He sat amidst the ruins of what might have been a schoolhouse, though the walls were so thoroughly blasted that certainty was impossible. Around him, the shapes that had once been men huddled motionless in the gloom. Were they sleeping? Were they dead? He could no longer tell, and the distinction seemed increasingly meaningless. Outside, the wind shrieked across the frozen wasteland with a sound like tearing metal, a relentless scream. The temperature had plummeted to minus 41 degrees Celsius. Fischer looked down at his hands, or what remained of them. His left hand was encased in a filthy bandage that hadn't been changed in 3 weeks. Underneath, he knew 3 fingers were black with gangrene. His right hand clutched a piece of bread the size of a postage stamp, his entire ration for the day. He stared at it, trying to recall what true hunger felt like, back when hunger was merely an empty stomach, and not this gnawing void that consumed him from the inside out. Beside him, Feldwebel Krause had ceased breathing sometime during the night. No one had noticed. No one had the strength left to care. Above them, somewhere in the black sky, artillery shells screamed overhead. Soviet shells, always Soviet shells, a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped. Fischer closed his eyes and tried to remember Germany, green fields, his mother's kitchen, the warm smell of bread baking. But those memories were fading, dissolving like frost in sunlight. There was only cold now, only hunger, only the absolute certainty that he would die in this frozen hell, and no one would ever know his name. The German Wehrmacht that marched toward Stalingrad in the summer of 1942 was the most powerful military force on Earth. Over 270,000 soldiers of the Sixth Army, veterans who had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and driven deep into the Soviet Union with the confidence of an unstoppable machine. They were led by General Friedrich Paulus, a meticulous staff officer who had helped plan Germany's greatest victories. They were equipped with Panzer III and IV tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, mechanized infantry mounted in half-tracks, and the full support of the Luftwaffe's most experienced bomber squadrons. Their mission was clear: capture Stalingrad, the industrial city sprawling along the Volga River, then drive south to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. Without oil, Stalin's war machine would collapse. Soviet tanks would become monuments, aircraft would rust on runways, the entire Red Army would grind to a halt. Hitler believed Stalingrad was the key to victory on the Eastern Front. More than that, he wanted it because it bore Stalin's name. Taking it would be both a strategic triumph and a symbolic humiliation of his ideological enemy. The German Wehrmacht that marched toward Stalingrad in the summer of 1942 wrote confident letters home. They sang marching songs. They spoke of being home for Christmas, of victory parades and medals and promotions. One lance corporal from Dresden wrote to his fiancée, "The Russians are finished. We will take Stalingrad in 2 weeks, maybe 3. Save your wedding dress. I will be home by October." He would never see home again. He would die in February, frozen solid in a basement, his body so emaciated that Soviet soldiers who found him thought he was a teenager. None of them, not the soldiers, not their officers, not even the generals in Berlin, understood that they were marching toward the largest tomb in military history. They were about to enter a nightmare from which only 6,000 of them would ever emerge alive. The offensive began with fire from the sky. On 23 August 1942, Over 600 Luftwaffe aircraft attacked Stalingrad in the most concentrated bombing raid of the Eastern Front. Juncker's U-87 Stuka dive bombers screamed down with their signature sirens wailing. Heinkel H-111 medium bombers flew in perfect formation, their bomb bays opening to release tons of high-explosive and incendiary ordnance. Dornier Do-17s followed in wave after wave, dropping their payloads on a city built largely of wood. The result was apocalyptic. Within hours, Stalingrad was consumed by firestorms that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Entire neighborhoods vanished in walls of flame. The Volga River itself appeared to burn as ruptured oil storage tanks spilled their contents into the water. Civilians who sought shelter in cellars suffocated as firestorms consumed all available oxygen. Others were incinerated where they stood. In a single afternoon, approximately 40,000 civilians died. When night fell, the flames were visible from 70 kilometers away, a hellish glow that turned night into day. Survivors emerged from shelters to find their world transformed into a landscape of ash and rubble. Buildings had collapsed into skeletal frameworks of twisted steel and broken concrete. Bodies lay in the streets, burned beyond recognition. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. But despite the devastation, despite the horror, the city did not surrender. Stalin had issued Order Number 227 on 28 July 1942, not one step back. The decree was absolute. Retreat without orders meant execution. Officers who withdrew would face firing squads. Soldiers who fled would be shot by NKVD blocking detachments positioned behind Soviet lines. There was no retreat. There was only victory or death. The German Wehrmacht that marched toward Stalingrad in the summer of 1942 crossed the Don River and pushed toward the burning city. The 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions led the assault, their tanks crushing Soviet defensive positions on the city's outskirts. Infantry followed in trucks and on foot, confident that the broken, demoralized enemy would collapse within days. They expected to fight through scattered resistance and plant the swastika flag on the banks of the Volga before September ended. Instead, they encountered something unexpected, a city that refused to die, and defenders who fought with the desperation of men who knew they had nowhere to retreat. General Vasily Chuikov took command of the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad on 12 September 1942, when German forces had already reached the city's center. Chuikov was a short, stocky veteran with a face like carved granite and a temper that terrified his subordinates. He had survived the Russian Civil War, Stalin's purges, and brutal campaigns in Finland. He understood immediately that conventional defensive tactics would fail. The Germans excelled at combined arms warfare, using tanks, artillery, and air power in coordinated assaults that shattered defensive lines. In open terrain, the Wehrmacht was unbeatable. But Stalingrad offered no open terrain. The Luftwaffe bomb had transformed it into a maze of rubble, collapsed buildings, and twisted infrastructure. Chuikov recognized that this hellscape was his advantage. He issued a brutally simple directive to his troops: hug the Germans. Soviet soldiers were ordered to stay within grenade-throwing distance of German positions at all times, close enough that German artillery couldn't fire without hitting their own men, close enough that Luftwaffe bombers couldn't distinguish friend from foe. Every building became a fortress, every pile of rubble became a defensive position, every basement became a bunker. The city would be defended block by block, house by house, room by room. The fighting that followed was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced in the war. In Poland, battles lasted days. In France, weeks at most. In Stalingrad, battles lasted months for single buildings. The combat was savage, personal, and utterly merciless. The grain elevator became a legend. This massive concrete structure near the Volga was defended by a small Soviet garrison, fewer than 50 men, against repeated German assaults supported by tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers. For 5 days, from 17th to 22nd September, the defenders held. German infantry attacked wave after wave, throwing grenades through windows, firing machine guns through doors, using flamethrowers to burn out defenders room by room. When German forces finally broke through on the 6th day, they found the garrison had been annihilated. Bodies were piled in stairwells, the floors were ankle-deep in spent shell casings, blood covered the walls. The Germans had lost over 100 men to capture one building. Pavlov's house became another symbol of impossible resistance. On 27 September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led a platoon across an exposed square and captured a 4-story apartment building. What followed was a 58-day siege that captured the imagination of the Soviet propaganda machine. Pavlov's men, Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and Georgians, representing the multinational Soviet state, fortified the building with mines, barbed wire, and machine gun nests at every window. They knocked holes through internal walls to move between rooms without exposing themselves to sniper fire. They dug a communication trench to the Volga for supplies. German forces attacked daily. Infantry assaults, tank-supported attacks, artillery bombardments that lasted hours and reduced surrounding buildings to rubble. They never took Pavlov's house. Soviet propaganda claimed that more Germans died attacking that single building than died taking Paris. While exaggerated, the claim contained a kernel of truth. In Stalingrad's close-quarters combat, defenders with determination could hold against overwhelming numbers. One German infantryman, a schoolteacher from Bavaria, wrote in his diary in mid-October, "We have been fighting for 15 days for a single house. The front is a corridor between burned-out rooms. It is the ceiling between 2 floors. We attack with grenades, machine guns, and bayonets. From story to story, we bombard each other in smoke and dust. We can hear the enemy breathing. We can smell them. We fight for a single room for 3 days, then realize they are still in the cellar below us. This is not war. This is annihilation." By late October, the Germans had captured most of Stalingrad's ruins and pushed Chuikov's 62nd Army into a narrow strip of rubble along the Volga, sometimes no more than a few hundred meters wide. But they couldn't deliver the final blow. Every attack gained meters at enormous cost. German casualties mounted into tens of thousands. Elite divisions were ground down to shadows of their former strength. Soviet losses were even higher. The 62nd Army was being bled white. Reinforcements had to be fed across the Volga under constant German artillery and air attack. Supply boats made their runs at night, navigating by the glow of burning buildings, dodging shells and Stuka attacks. Many boats never arrived. The river bottom became a graveyard of sunken barges and drowned men. But the Soviets had one critical advantage. They could replace their losses. Behind the Ural Mountains, beyond German bomber range, Soviet factories were producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition at accelerating rates. Stalin could afford to lose divisions because new divisions were being formed every week. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts with a smaller population and industrial capacity, could not sustain the same attrition. Then came November, and with it, the cold. The first snow fell on 2nd November, light flurries that melted on rubble still warm from fires. German soldiers who'd survived the previous winter outside Moscow felt dread. They remembered what Russian winter meant. They had been promised winter clothing would arrive from Germany by early December. They had been assured the battle would be over before the worst cold arrived. Both promises were lies. By mid-November, temperatures dropped to -10 degrees Celsius, then -15 degrees Celsius. German soldiers still wore the same standard-issue wool uniforms they'd worn in August, tunics and trousers designed for Central European weather, not Siberian cold. They had no proper winter coats, no insulated boots, no cold weather gear. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers from Germany couldn't deliver what didn't exist. Winter clothing was still being manufactured. Fuel was rationed because partisan attacks had increased on rail lines. Food shipments became irregular.
Paulus requested permission to withdraw from Stalingrad and establish a winter defensive line further west. Hitler refused. The Führer had publicly announced Stalingrad would fall. German newsreels had shown confident soldiers raising flags over captured positions. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had described the battle as Germany's greatest Eastern Front victory. Retreat was politically impossible. Hitler would not allow it. On November 19, 1942, that refusal became a death sentence for the entire Sixth Army. The Soviet counteroffensive began at 7:20 a.m. in fog and snow so thick visibility was measured in meters. Over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously along an 80-kilometer front north of Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 80 minutes, a rolling thunder that shattered Romanian defensive positions, destroyed command posts, and obliterated communication trenches. The Romanian Third Army holding the northern flank was poorly equipped and undermotivated. Their anti-tank guns dated from World War I and couldn't penetrate Soviet armor. Romanian soldiers had repeatedly warned German commanders that their positions were vulnerable. Those warnings had been dismissed. At 8:50 a.m., Soviet armor attacked. Hundreds of T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks emerged from the snow like steel ghosts. The T-34, with its sloped armor and wide tracks, was superior to most German tanks and nearly invincible against Romanian weapons. Romanian soldiers broke and fled. Within hours, the front collapsed. Soviet mobile units raced southwest, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting supply lines, and overrunning rear area depots. The next day, 20th November, the nightmare repeated in the south. Another massive barrage pulverized Romanian positions south of Stalingrad. More Soviet tanks broke through. German reserves rushed to plug gaps, but panzer divisions that should have maneuvered at 40 kilometers per hour crawled on fumes. Fuel had been prioritized for units fighting in Stalingrad itself. On 23 November, at Kalach, 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad, the pincers closed. Soviet forces from north and south met and linked up. The trap snapped shut. The entire German Sixth Army, over 290,000 men, was encircled. Inside the pocket, initial reactions mixed confusion with confidence. German forces had been encircled before, at Demyansk earlier in 1942, and had been successfully supplied by air until ground forces broke through. Surely the same would happen here. Paulus's quartermaster calculated the army needed 500 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and winter clothing. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Luftwaffe commander and Hitler's close confidant, personally assured the Führer that his air force could deliver those supplies. He cited previous airlift operations as proof. The Luftwaffe could do this. He guaranteed it. It was perhaps the most catastrophic lie told during the entire war. The Luftwaffe did not have 500 tons of daily airlift capacity. Distances were too great, over 200 kilometers from the nearest German airfields. Weather was too unpredictable, with blizzards and fog that grounded aircraft for days. Soviet fighters, Yak-1s, Lag-3s, and American-supplied P-39 Airacobras patrolled relentlessly. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket. Airfields inside were under constant artillery bombardment. The primary transport, the Junkers Ju-52, was slow, lumbering, and defenseless.
Soviet fighters hunted them mercilessly. On the best days, the airlift delivered 100 tons. Average days brought 50 tons. Many days, nothing arrived. Over the next 10 weeks, the Luftwaffe would lose over 500 transport aircraft, destroyed by fighters, anti-aircraft fire, crashes, and engine failures in the extreme cold. Inside the pocket, rations were cut immediately. The normal German combat ration provided 3,000 calories daily. Within days of encirclement, soldiers received 300 grams of bread, smaller than a fist, then 200 grams. By December, 100 grams, the size of a playing card. Meat disappeared. Vegetables became memories. Horses were slaughtered systematically. Over 30,000 animals were butchered for food. Soldiers ate horse meat boiled into thin stew. When the horses were gone, they ate anything organic. Leather belts were boiled. Soldiers chewed frozen grass. They scraped frost from walls because water supplies had frozen solid. Starvation set in with terrifying speed. Bodies designed to operate on 3,000 calories during combat received perhaps 700. Muscle mass disappeared as bodies consumed protein for energy. Fat reserves vanished. Then organs began breaking down: liver, kidneys, heart, to survive. Men became skeletal. Eyes sunk into skulls. Skin turned gray. They moved slowly, conserving every calorie because walking expended energy they couldn't replace. But the cold was infinitely worse. December brought temperatures that veterans said they'd never experienced. -30 degrees became normal, -35, -40 degrees on the worst days. At these temperatures, the world becomes hostile to life. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath freezes in lungs. Metal becomes so cold that touching it tears flesh away. Weapons malfunction. Vehicle engines refuse to start. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms with perhaps one scavenged layer, were dying of exposure by the thousands. Frostbite became epidemic. Soldiers wrapped feet in newspaper, in rags from corpses, in anything for insulation. Nothing helped. Toes turned white, then gray, then black as tissue died. Fingers became useless. Ears and noses blackened and fell off. Field hospitals, primitive aid stations in cellars filled with frostbite casualties. Surgeons performed amputations at candlelight with hacksaws, without anesthesia, because medical supplies had vanished. Men screamed as blackened extremities were removed. Many died of shock. Survivors became cripples, unable to walk or hold weapons, but still trapped with no evacuation possible. One Wehrmacht medical officer wrote on 15th of December, "Performed 14 amputations today. No anesthesia, no bandages, no antibiotics. I saw off dead tissue and hope they don't die from infections. Most do. The smell is unbearable. Gangrene and necrosis."
Yesterday, a boy from Frankfurt, 19, begged me to cut off both feet. They were black to the ankles. I refused, hoping to save them. He shot himself. I cannot blame him. Sleep became suicide. Soldiers knew falling asleep in the open meant freezing to death. They huddled together in cellars, sharing body heat. Even so, men woke to find those beside them frozen solid during the night. The dead were stripped immediately. The living needed those layers more than corpses needed dignity. Fuel was so scarce that vehicles sat immobile, engines frozen, abandoned. Tanks became shelters, crews huddled inside steel hulls that at least blocked the wind. Soldiers burned furniture, then structural beams, then anything wooden. When wood ran out, they tried burning uniforms, leather, even frozen corpses soaked in precious fuel. The psychological toll was immense. Men watched friends die slowly from starvation and cold. They listened to Soviet loudspeakers broadcasting in German, promising hot food and medical care for those who surrendered. They received letters from home describing Christmas celebrations, warm houses, children opening presents, letters describing a world that no longer seemed real. Some committed suicide, a gunshot in the night, a body hanging from a rafter. Others simply gave up, stopped eating meager rations, stopped moving, waited for death. The German word fingerling emerged, the freezing ones, soldiers who had lost hope and were dying of cold but not yet dead, sitting motionless, staring at nothing, waiting for the end. Christmas 1942 arrived with temperatures at -38 degrees Celsius. No celebrations, no songs, no traditional meals. Soldiers sat in frozen ruins eating 100-gram bread rations if they'd been fortunate enough to receive any. The Luftwaffe attempted special Christmas packages, chocolates, cigarettes, luxuries to boost morale. Less than a quarter made it through. Soviet fighters shot down transports. Others dropped cargo outside the pocket where Soviet soldiers collected German packages and laughed. One sergeant from Hamburg wrote on Christmas night, "Christmas in hell. Mueller died today, just sat against the wall and never got up. We're too weak to move his body. Tomorrow we'll cut strips from his uniform to wrap our feet. God forgive us. God forgive Germany for sending us here." By early January 1943, the pocket had shrunk dramatically. Soviet forces attacked relentlessly, using massive artillery barrages followed by infantry and tank assaults. German defenders, weakened by starvation and cold, could barely hold positions. Ammunition was critically low. Machine gunners received 50 rounds daily, not enough to repel determined assaults. Soldiers were told to conserve bullets, let enemies get close before firing. The airfield at Potomnik, the main supply drop zone, fell to Soviet forces on 16 January. Thousands of wounded waiting for evacuation were captured. The last airfield, Gumrak, fell on 22 January. Even the trickle of supplies stopped. The Sixth Army was sealed in its tomb, dying by degrees. Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal on 30 January, a promotion carrying dark implication. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was an order disguised as honor. Paulus was expected to fight to the death or commit suicide. Inside the pocket, such pronouncements meant nothing. Soldiers were past caring about heroism or propaganda. They cared only for survival, making it through the next hour. But for most, survival was impossible. On 31 January 1943, Friedrich Paulus sat in the basement of the Uniform department store, the final headquarters of the Sixth Army. Above, Soviet tanks cleared the last blocks of resistance. Around him, staff officers waiting in silence, faces gaunt, uniforms hanging loosely on starved frames. Outside, -42 degrees, the wind howling. Paulus had received Hitler's message promoting him to field marshal. He understood the expectation: die here in battle or by his own hand rather than surrender. For hours he sat in silence. He thought of 91,000 men still alive, starving, freezing, waiting for orders that would never save them. He thought of hundreds of thousands already dead. He thought of promises of relief that never came, supplies that never arrived. At 7:35 a.m. on 2 February 1943, Paulus surrendered. The southern pocket laid down weapons. 2 days later, the northern pocket surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of 290,000 Germans encircled in November, approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. But survival was relative. They were skeletal, disease-ridden, frostbitten, broken. Average weight had dropped below 50 kilograms. Many could barely walk. Soviet POW camps, themselves struggling with supplies, became death camps. Over the following months and years, thousands more died from typhus, dysentery, malnutrition, and untreated frostbite. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Most didn't survive past 1943.
The Soviet Union counted its own catastrophic losses. An estimated 478,000 Soviet soldiers died, with over 1 million wounded. Civilian casualties approached 50,000. The city was obliterated. Not a single building was structurally intact. The factories Stalin fought to hold were twisted metal. But the strategic impact was seismic. Germany lost an entire army, one of its finest forces. The Sixth Army ceased to exist. 22 divisions, hundreds of thousands of men who had marched confidently across Europe, were gone. Equipment losses were staggering: 900 aircraft, 1,500 tanks, 6,000 artillery pieces, 60,000 vehicles. More importantly, Stalingrad broke the myth of German invincibility. The blitzkrieg that terrified Europe was stopped, surrounded, and destroyed, not primarily by tactics or heroism, but by the mathematics of encirclement, starvation, and cold. Today, the ruins have been rebuilt as Volgograd. Mamayev Kugan, the contested hill, is crowned with the Motherland Calls, an 85-meter statue visible for miles. Beneath that statue, in soil churned by millions of shells, workers still occasionally find relics: bullets, helmets, dog tags, bones. German and Soviet, they lie together in the earth, united in death.
The soldiers who died in Stalingrad, German and Soviet alike, didn't die for grand strategy or ideology. They died because they were there, trapped in a battle neither side could abandon. Germans died because Hitler refused retreat. They died because Göring promised supplies that never arrived. They died because no one planned for winter. They died of hunger in a pocket that received flights but never enough supplies. They died of cold because wool uniforms and summer boots couldn't protect against 40-below temperatures. The German corporal from Dresden, who wrote confidently about being home by October, froze to death in a basement in February. The schoolteacher from Bavaria, who described fighting for a single room, died of starvation on January 28th, his diary found beside his body. The sergeant from Hamburg, who wrote about Christmas in Hell, was captured on 2nd February and died in a Soviet POW camp 6 weeks later. Stalingrad stands as a monument not to war's glory, but to its absolute horror. It demonstrates what happens when human beings are ground down between the unyielding machines of total war and the crushing indifference of winter. It shows that courage, training, and superior equipment mean nothing against starvation and cold. It proves that even the mightiest army can be destroyed not by enemy strength alone, but by its leaders' refusal to accept reality. The nightmare lasted 290 days, and when it finally ended, Hitler's army was frozen, starved, and defeated in the snow. But even as Stalingrad's frozen ruins still smoldered, another battlefront was opening in North Africa, where young American soldiers would face their baptism of fire against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Join us next time as we uncover the brutal lessons of Kasserine Pass, where the U.S. Army discovered that courage alone cannot win a modern war.